And we are going to begin the day with a panel discussion with representatives from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, on institution building as it relates to multi-sectoral partnerships and investments. After the panel discussion, we're going to receive a series of reports and updates from the Committee on Awards and Facilities and the NSF Commission on Merit Review. Topics of discussions and action will include NSF Indigenous Community Engagement, a discussion and recommendation for a vote related to NSF's Antarctic Support Contract, and finally, a presentation by and discussion with members of the NSF-NSV Commission on Merit Review on their final recommendations. The last session of the day will include a discussion and vote on the 2025 NSB Honorary Awards. So we're going to now begin with a panel discussion about how we combine forces across sectors to advance our nation's science and engineering enterprise. Yesterday's panel surfaced this issue, and we now have an opportunity to put on our hats as creative, curious intellectuals and to start dreaming up institutions for the future. So please take it, again, we did experiments yesterday in that spirit, right? In the spirit of creativity and getting everybody's thinking about what's possible, right? As opposed to having final answers. Again, very quickly, let me remind you some key features of the change landscape. We've seen now that we're probably in a path by the end of the decade to have a $1 trillion sector, right? We're 800 billion plus, that continues to grow. So let's imagine end of the decade, $1 trillion sector where the participants of that sector incorporate the federal government, philanthropy, and of course, the university ecosystem and the business sector. And in the government, and we'll have an opportunity to reflect on that, it's not just the federal government, but state governments that make very significant investments in this space. We've shared figures in the past of how different this landscape looks like in terms of business investment, now accounting for 78% of all US R&D. And while the federal government is moving forward towards a national science and technology strategy, that is likely to be insufficient to have an all-of-nation strategy. And we're going to need to figure out mechanisms to coordinate and align investments across all these different stakeholders. But we have two key problems. First, how do we bring together the governmental, state and federal, business, philanthropic, and academic sectors to identify and strategically coordinate on problems that can only be solved if we work together? Who should participate? And as it was stated yesterday, who leads that effort? Second, how can these sectors nimbly and effectively coordinate and align investments, especially to amplify existing solutions, regardless of where the original idea came from? So today's panel features three experts who are going to help us understand broadly how we may approach these questions. Don't expect the final answers, as I say, but we heard yesterday from Panj on the progress that he and Erwin and the leadership team have made in this space of partnerships. So in today's discussions, we're going to have an opportunity to learn more about what else has been tried around the nation and what could be tried. I'd like to point out that this panel is itself a new form of partnership. We have talked about science and technology as the new currency of power. And CSIS is without a doubt one of the world's leading national security think tanks. They have independently reached the conclusion that national security, and I quote, is determined as much by global technological and commercial competition as it is by traditional defense. So this has led us to collaborate in imagining how we can address this approach to multi-sectoral partnerships. So with that, I want to introduce now our panelists. Navin Girishankar is president of the Economic Security and Technology Department at CSIS. a new department that has been stood up to respond to this dimension of the change landscape. Navin came to CSIS from the Department of Commerce, where he played a key role in strategic thinking on critical technologies, including the CHIPS Act. Andrew Reamer is a research professor at the George Washington Institute for Public Policy at George Washington University. His research efforts aim to encourage U.S. national economic development and competitiveness. Critically, he works at the boundary between research and practice, aiming to be useful to public decision makers. And Erica Fuchs is a Kachi Mora professor of the Department of Engineering and Public Policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Her research focuses on the development, commercialization, and global manufacturing of emerging technologies and national policy in that context. She was a founding director of the National Network for Critical Technology Assessment, funded by the TIP Directorate, and which culminated in the report Securing America's Future, a framework for critical technology assessment. Erica currently serves on the board of trustees for NatCast and has been appointed by President Biden to the White House Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Navin.
Thank you, Dario. I hope you can hear me. I'm calling from Korea. I really thank you for the opportunity to present before you. And I see Dr. Panchanathan there as well. So greetings to you. This really started. Good to see you, Navin. Good to see you, sir. It really started with a conversation Dario and I had, a couple months back. And he really, I think, to put it in my own words, he said, how do we organize to deliver a modern science and technology and innovation strategy? There's a very complex mosaic of institutions across the country doing things, trying to address different types of goals and operating at different levels. How do we do this well? How do we organize to deliver? And so I'm going to ask Brandon if he could forward the slide, advance the slide. We view science and technology innovation as at the heart of economic security because we're in a world where there are rising global threats and geostrategic competition. You can click forward. We put out some recent work on this, and I'm going to forward to the next slide to really capture the essence of, I think, what Dario said, which is that we're facing ever more complex economic security challenges that will place significant demands on our STI ecosystems. And so if you look at the last two administrations, we've been trying to achieve competitiveness, resilience, and national security goals, and we're addressing a set of challenges, some of which have been with us for some time. You can continue to click forward. These, the way I describe them, is a legacy of almost 40 years of economic dislocation, people and places left behind, as President Biden has described it, and President-elect Trump as well. The fact that we're in the midst of not one, but probably 5, maybe more Sputnik moments. I think, Dario, you've spoken about this. Even as we've come to recognize that dual use risks are heightened. And then click again. Coming out of the pandemic, click again, please. A recognition that we are in a world in which there are supply chain choke points. And so those sets of challenges really place lots of pressure on our ecosystem to try and address all of them. And just take a look at the set of economic security policies that emerged under the Biden-Harris agenda. Promote policies like our industrial strategy investments, which include R&D commercialization and scaling. Protect policies from export controls and investment screening, to partner policies, which are new economic engagements with partners. This matrix of policies, while they may change in the coming administration, the basic goals and the basic challenges, I think, it's more about continuity than change. And so really the question of how we organize to deliver is actually a deliberate choice, and one in which we can build on our strengths and, importantly, build on many, many years of lessons from experience. But we'll have to make deliberate choices of how we organize ourselves. And so if we move to the next slide, I think it's worth maybe going backwards before going forwards And Andrew and I were doing a lot of brainstorming around this, and actually, we already have a federated STI ecosystem. It reflects organic growth, it reflects institutional diversity, system complexity, and yes, probably some redundancy, which is natural given the sophistication of our system and how old it is. But if you think about this as purely private or market organized institutions, some that are purely public and everything in between, some addressing national priorities and others driving local advantages and local priorities. You can see over time, and I'm going to hand over to Andrew, quite a range of institutions that have been developed over the years, including recently. And so this is a story of institutional innovation in response to needs. And then through accretion, of course, one has to see whether it's fit for purpose. And with that, let me just ask Andrew to give us a little bit of color on what we're looking at here.
Thank you, Navin, and hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. If you look at this, there are a few buckets I'm going to identify. One is fast-acting reactive efforts to address an issue, and those are on the several of them are on the right, beginning 2 centuries ago with trying to develop muskets that have standardized parts because they fell apart in the War of 1812. Operation Warp Speed, NASA putting a person on the moon, and the Manhattan Project, Office of Science R&D, all were created on the fly, and it was a collaborative effort with success. The next set of categories are efforts by the federal government to change how markets work. And there's one approach is to put some rules in place, like Bayh-Dole and Stevenson-Weidler, so that when the government funds research, it is transferred to the marketplace without Congress having to have its finger in it every time, that people have motivations to do that. The second way that the government influences the private sector is with money, and NSF it has that kind of role. DARPA has that kind of role. Manufacturing innovation institutes have that kind of role. There's another category where the federal government brings people together, and we had a great example yesterday at the Roadmap Summit with NSF and EDA bringing together hundreds of people from the public and private sector across the federal government at the state level to connect, and with a thicker network of relationships that emerge out of that. The Select USA Summit is another example of that. Last two categories. One is at the policy level. So OSTP was codified in almost 50 years ago, and to the interests of the National Science Board, preceding the law that creates this is a section on science, technology, policy, organization, and priorities, identifying mandates for federal cooperation with external stakeholders. And that is state and local governments, the private sector, academia. And I would suggest that this mandate has been honored in the breach in the last 50 years, but it's on the books, and that's something to build on. The last item is all the way on the left, the state and regional STI strategies, which, as you might know, the federal government has not been in this space in terms of competitiveness strategy for quite some time. The states have. And beginning in the early 80s, and as recently as just a couple of weeks ago, states over and over and over again are convening at the state level people from business, government, academia to come up with a consensus strategy. I showed this to Dario before the talk. This is from Arkansas, Building an Innovation-Led Future for Arkansas. This demonstrates the implementation of the principles that Congress laid out in 1976. And so I think it's quite instructive for the National Science Board. So with that, Navin, I'll stop there.
Got 2 more slides and then we'll pass on to Erica. So Brandon, if I can just trouble you with one more. So, here's some illustrative institutional models. Andrew's already spoken to this. He spoke about Arkansas. That's one example. Another example are collaborations between federal, subnational, and private. So Select USA's, the Roadmap Summit yesterday. Obviously, national strategies that are driving strategic public investments to leverage private investment. We know the story with the CHIPS Act, bipartisan infrastructure law are examples. And then I think what's very, very interesting, and Dario mentioned Erica's role on NatCast, purpose-built nonprofits for R&D and R&D commercialization. So there's NatCast. There are versions of this with the Tech Hubs and the Tech Hubs Consortia. New York creates the Albany Nanotech Complex. I think the point of this is not to give a complete list, but it's to say two things. One is that we have a rich institutional mosaic. In fact, that's one of the saving graces of the setup that we have in this country, which is it's not that we lack the institutions that are responding to the needs. In fact, we have quite a few of them. So to solve the problem of are we fit for purpose, creating another national institution to try and address this in and of itself will not solve the problem. And so here's where I'm going to go to the next slide before passing on to Erica. So Brandon will advance it if you don't mind. Yep. We thought of it might be useful to think about this as 5 tests for whether any of these institutional models are fit for purpose. Number one is how effective are they at goal setting, and are they happening at the right level? Meaning, are we pushing down the responsibility for setting goals to the closest point? It's a federalist model, to the lowest possible point where it could be done efficiently, and are we empowering public and private to do that? Secondly, how effective is collaboration and coordination across public and private sectors, including the stacking of capital, which Dario mentioned, which is, are they leveraging and stacking capital to fund the various goals they have, whether it's R&D commercialization, or scaling? Third, importantly, in the world that we're in now, how are national security concerns being priced in? They're everybody's business. But how are the responsible parties, whether public or private, say, for example, in a tech hub or in NatCast, supporting national security goals, or at least monitoring and mitigating national security risks? Fourth, very important, who's calling balls and strikes? Are we evaluating effectively in real time what's working and what's not working? And then in the boisterous democracy that we have, are we equipped to make course corrections, meaning acknowledging failures, withdrawing support when something's not working, and then improving continuously through time? Our sense is like these are the tests that we should be applying to the different models that we put in place. And so with that, I would say that probably number one is the most important, which is priority setting and goal setting. And with that, we're going to hand over to Erica, who's done quite a bit of interesting work on this topic. So thank you, and thanks for your consideration.
All right. So with the globalization of knowledge and production networks and the economic coupling that comes with that, and the increasing sources of geopolitical conflict, disasters, including climate and health, and technological shocks, nations face new challenges to national security, economic prosperity, and the well-being of all citizens. Rather than strategic, forward-looking assessments, my notes just disappeared, and prioritization of technology investments and policy actions, our country is being caught off guard by the next crisis, whether that is AI or semiconductor shortages or shortages in masks and respirators. And so leading up to, first under the Trump administration and during the COVID pandemic, and then following that under the Biden administration, have been testifying about the need for analytics to inform national technology strategy. And incredibly enough, Congress, in a bipartisan effort, came forward and designated that in consultation with the Interagency Working Group, the National Science Foundation Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate will identify and annually review and update a list of not more than 5 U.S. societal, national, and geostrategic challenges that may be addressed by technology, not more than 10 key technology focus areas. And I will have to say, Congress listed, it took it upon itself to list 10 of these. And there's like at least like 10 words after each, like number 2, number 3. It's a little above my pay grade, how they all got there. But most importantly, it asks TIP to evaluate the relationship between US societal, national, and geostrategic challenges and the key technology focus areas. And the problem is, I would argue, none of us are quite sure how to do that. So in his brilliance, go back. In his brilliance, I can see Erwin. In his brilliance, Erwin decided that he should fund, and I want to quote Erwin, I don't want to fund one person. I want the best minds in the country, Erica, to the best analytic minds, bringing the best in class from universities across the country to help him identify how to first demonstrate what could the country do right now? What could they do? And then go forward and say, what should be a framework for dealing with this in the future? In undertaking this effort, which culminated in Securing America's Future, a framework for critical technology assessment, in short, we had industry leaders, CTOs of companies, senior vice presidents of technology at the table throughout, including informing our analytics and informing, not saying academia, this is what you should do, but saying, have you thought about this problem? Or that's not really the thing that we're worried about. And we also had individuals from the different agencies at the table throughout this process. So in Securing America's Future, when you see anonymous in the reviewers, we had 44 reviewers in a 2-stage review process, including CTOs of companies, Intel, Lockheed Martin. The anonymous is not the companies, that's the government. So reviewing, those are the bureaucrats inside saying, I can't do something with this. So we have been pushing forward these capabilities and what is possible. And what I want to show you, drawing from the work of the National Network and some work we've done since, is that it is indeed possible. And I know Erwin has pushed forward funding, particularly around the first bullet as well. It is possible to provide timely awareness. We have to take that differently in different contexts. It's possible to quantify vulnerabilities and to quantify in that sense criticality, not just on a national security perspective, but also on a health perspective, depending on different measures, also on an economic perspective, on a labor perspective. And it is possible to prioritize action. And we can do this quantitatively in the same way any business does. We can also identify the value of interventions. And we can do this embracing and understanding and presenting to agencies, to legislators, different missions and how those different missions might have win-wins across them or have interdependencies or maybe have trade-offs between them. So how do we embrace these technology interdependencies, these mission and global interdependencies? And most importantly, we have to look back then and say, how did we do, right? Any company, any good company does that. So And by the way, Andrew Marshall with net assessment and modern defense strategy, so much is analogous between how businesses do things and how countries can do things. So first, quantifying vulnerabilities. This is from the National Network for Critical Technology Assessment. Here, what they did is and I want to be very clear about this, they went around to experts and said, let's just take the lowest hanging fruit. Give us like 10 things that you're really worried about happening in terms of scenarios. China restricting lithium, China restricting graphite, a natural disaster in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Just give us what you're worried about, and tell us like how much. And then what they did is they had across MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and Georgia Tech, they had some of the top models in the country at MIT, critical minerals and capabilities, mines across the world, but also the resources underneath and the potential for new mines to come back up online. At Carnegie Mellon, models of the automotive sector and also of the production of parts in the auto sector. And at Georgia Tech, issues of demographic and geographic diversity and how different populations would be impacted. And so what you can see here, for example, China restricted graphite. They modeled before China restricted graphite, China restricting graphite, what would happen? And they combined these other models with a global market competitiveness model. Using all of this is using very, very detailed ground level industry production data and mine production data. So what they said is what happens if any of these scenarios come into play. Graphite, in terms of economic impact, isn't even on the list. I just want to be clear about this. So we were talking subsequently with Commerce, you're like, graphite, we're not really worried. China restricting lithium exports by just 15% could have the same impact in terms of $24 billion in consumer surplus losses as the semiconductor shortage did in the automotive sector. And this is for both electric and conventional vehicles. That equals $22,000 to $25,000. $22,000 to $25,000 labor wage months of job losses as well, in terms of because we can't produce cars. So we've got to worry about that one. That's economically critical to our security. All right. Same thing. DRC has a natural disaster. Same order of magnitude. These are the things we need to worry about from an economic security standpoint. Also, it doesn't matter if DRC has a natural disaster or we have a geopolitical conflict. All the same, big impacts. But we can also, slow and going forward. Yes, there we go. We can also look at the value of intervention and prioritize then those interventions. We're not going to worry about the graphite intervention. We're going to worry about lithium, and we're going to worry about cobalt. But we also can say we don't have to take it over the top. We don't need 2 billion mines of lithium, right? To be able to fulfill expected production volumes by 2030, we need to increase our supply of lithium by 100 kilotons of LCE equivalent, okay? So that would ameliorate this shortage. This is the type of analysis we need to inform. We tried putting in, okay, what if 80% of vehicles were LFP, so cobalt free? Any cobalt-free battery. How does that change it? Well, that gets us down there. Maybe we need 90%. Maybe we need 100%. That would ameliorate that dependence on the Democratic Republic of Congo. These are the ways we can start to then say, now there's a different question. How do we get there, right? That's yet another question we have to look at. Do we want to have the lithium mine in Nevada, for example? Do we want to improve with NSF funding, advancing the performance of LFP batteries? These are all ways to think about, and there's multiple things that then need to happen at that next step, but we can look at where we should be focusing our funding in order to get there. It's very slow in transitioning. I also want to talk about what we can assess in terms of workforce capabilities. The people we brought together for the national network are people with extraordinarily deep contacts with industry. They are using industry data and working with industry. So here you can see the Manufacturing Incentives Program under the CHIPS Act. Intel is being incentivized to put a facility and is putting a facility in Columbus, Ohio. TI is putting a facility in Sherman Denniston, Texas. So what I'm giving you is one example here from shop floor level data. We are able to say what are the tasks of workers, and we can match that to the capabilities in metropolitan statistical areas at that fine-grained at a level through the ONET database. This work, again, by the national network. So you can see that if you could train someone with 75% skill similarity, I'm not saying you can, to be a semiconductor processing technician. And we can actually look like, oh, look, radiology technicians look really similar to semiconductor processing technicians, and they just had a bunch of jobs go overseas. You still don't have the 3,000 people you need in order to have the semiconductor processing technicians you need in Columbus, Ohio. However, and I don't know if you can, 50% of skill similarity, we now have a large enough labor pool right in that area. Okay, so if we can train people with 50% skill similarity, now you can say, what are you going to use? Are you going to use smart tutors to train these people? Are you going to, what's your strategy is then the next step. So that would work in Columbus, Ohio. Unfortunately for TI, sorry, even if you could train people with 50% skill similarity, there still aren't the 4,500 semiconductor processing technicians that they would need for Sherman Denison, Texas. So they're going to have to take a different strategy, right? Are they moving people in there? Are they having relocation issues? But again, this helps inform how we think about these problems. It's really slow and changing. Okay, great. And this last one I want to show because we have to understand, this is actually from Carnegie Mellon post the national network, but we have other examples in the national network. We have to understand and avoid our unintended consequences of policy action. Now, we may want to still take this action. I want to be very clear about this. But here, the government has been using priority rated contracts and across both administrations, right? So in COVID-19, this is saying that if you receive a government priority rated contract and they are under the Defense Production Act mandatory, if they are under, they were used Defense Production Act, Operations Warp Speed, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Commerce. We have over 3,000 of these being used across the country and growing across both administrations. So this is during COVID-19. You can see, of course, during the treatment, a company must fill the government contract, right? You can imagine in ventilators, this makes sense, right? You have to fill the government contract and we have to get ventilators out to our people first, right? So during the treatment, of course, the US's global market share goes down because we're not selling. You're not allowed as a company to sell to anybody else. However, after the treatment, our global market share goes down even more. So no longer are you required, but you've lost those contracts. And here, what I'm showing you is in Europe. So on average, across the contracts that we look at, the US's market share long-term declines by 18% across products. China gains, so the Europe, our ally, becomes more reliant on China for its products during the period, but also afterwards. The rest of the world, what you're seeing there is driven in large part by Australia kind of coming up and taking over some of what China had initially gained. What we're working on right now is, sometimes we may need to do this, but what are the options that we maybe want to do this slightly differently? Or also, why was it, and this was where I think it comes back to NSF, is why was it that there is one product where this didn't happen? So this is on average across all the products. And we believe in that product, we were better. So possibly what happened is we funded, they went over to a different lower cost producer, and then they were like, oh, get me away from that, and came back. So in all the others, that was not the case. And so this is the type of analysis we need to do. So I want to conclude. Sorry, it's very slow in changing. So the CHIPS and Science Act calls for a new federal capacity. This was a bipartisan act. It started under the previous administration, continued under this one. A new capacity to fortify the nation's leadership and abilities to determine policies and investments that will ensure national security, global competitiveness, economic security, and societal well-being. This type of assessment, which I'm showing you, is essential to ensure that the country smartly invests and enacts necessary policies to achieve short and long-term security economic prosperity, and broad-based societal well-being of all of its citizens. So what I would argue is we must use the best minds in the country, and we should do this in a way that brings the full capacity of the country to bear. It's impossible to get the type of talent we need inside government in the long term to build this. We are bringing together, in what we did in the national network, the very leading in academia modeling and tools and analytic processes together in new ways. So in the same way that the TIP has been funded as an ARPA-like entity in certain fashions, we need to learn from ARPA-like entities in orchestrating and marshaling across the country. And there is no better place to do that than bringing together the researchers, the disciplines, the institutions that we need to inform our future. And the last thing I want to say about that is having the government players across the government and industry at the table was essential. We had to have objectivity. We're just academics. We're just the data, right? That's all I could tell you. But at the same time, we didn't know if something was the right question necessarily. And an academic is going to say, oh, wow, I'm not quite, I didn't think of this. That's interesting. But we also didn't know if industry was going to hate it. And we were sometimes surprised. We had a situation where we had leadership in from across industry, Lockheed Martin, Intel, and we thought, we were like, oh man, we're going upstream here. And Intel loved it. We were like, really? So they saw the problem too. And we need to be having those dialogues.
So. Wonderful. So we're going to have now an opportunity to open up for questions. So please be prepared, and maybe you can help me, Andy, or somebody with the process to make sure I don't end up out of line. So I just had one quick reflection around that. So yesterday, as a board, we spent time to some degree understanding the inputs, right? When we were having discussions around where we invest the dollars, where does it go across disciplines, and so on. I think one of the fascinating elements of this discussion is that we're focused on the outcomes. And I think that to the extent that by being much more analytical and rigorous across multiple dimensions on understanding what is the outcome that we're seeking with the investments in science and technology, particularly when it relates to economic, health, and national security implications, that in itself, that clarity in itself will be a catalyst to bring stakeholders together to achieve those outcomes. Because absent that, we end up having a conversation all about inputs, which is, can you just give me more money because I want to do more science, or can you give me more things? But it's very hard to bring the other people at the table. Is like, what problem are we trying to solve, and why does it matter so much to you, to me? I think that you were bringing that point. What is other people have to gain by doing that? So that's one reflection. And for us as a board to think a lot more about the quantification of outcomes. We know we're creating a lot of value with the investments that the National Science Foundation makes, but do we have the clarity of what are those outcomes that are being generated, and can we articulate it to the different stakeholders? Because in so doing, we're much more likely to do a lot more. I think the second thing that I think was very particularly interesting, Andrew, is that in that context of outcomes, states have a much more sophisticated and rigorous process of determining outcomes than the federal government. And that's a very important thing for us to learn from, because they are forced to come together across those sectors because they want their jobs, they need to solve those problems that are happening in the context. And when one learns, we had a chance to visit NY Creates together as a board, sharing the example of Arkansas, but Andrew, I think I'm not wrong, that is probably happening in every state. And they are much more involved around science and technology related matters. And they see it as a way for better living, solving real problems in their community. And they've been at this now for quite a few decades. It's not like they just started a month ago. And there's a lot to learn from what that can be. And the last thought I had in terms of imagining institutions. And I think the priority list that Navin provided of what is the test as to how well our ecosystem is working is fantastic. But I just wanted to just put a thought, right, for debate. In the structure that we see often across states where there's a nonprofit that gets created, right, like NY Creates or so on, that serves as a vehicle. It typically has a governance board. The nonprofit has a public good objective that they're trying to achieve. And it serves as an institutional vehicle with which those stakeholders in a state can co-invest to achieve an objective. You all saw it with NY Creates, right? So as an example, capital is provided by the state, but operational expenses are provided by the parties. The ratio of OPEX to CAPEX was 10-1. $20 billion were invested over a 20-year period. So there was a very sophisticated mechanism of governance, transparency, accountability, public good, protecting taxpayer dollars, all of those elements around that. So similar institutions of nonprofits exist across states all over the country. So imagine for a minute a network of these nonprofits that are active on each state. Each one is doing their own, but you could imagine improved level of potential coordination around these actors across different states. You could imagine federal programs that would treat that network as part of the ecosystem that makes the success of the science and technology agenda for the nation viable. You could imagine tax incentives. You could imagine matching grants. You can imagine coordination, just like you have the Governors Association coming. You can imagine annual conferences where people come together and say, what priorities are you doing? There's a whole range of possibilities that you could imagine, and that when time comes to pass, we would see that ecosystem of nonprofits or equivalent across states where they're solving their in-place innovation characteristics as an indispensable element of the network that makes science and technology successful in the United States. That's just an example of like possibilities that could happen. So with that as a prelude, let me open it up. I think order, we have Suresh, Marvi, Scott, Dorota, and Kevin. And then can you add me please? And the director, of course. Yeah. All right, Suresh, please.
Thank you, Dario. Thanks for the panel for wonderful developing a quantitative model for figuring out where the need is needed. So I really appreciate that. So I would like to know the data, is it includes the small and medium scale enterprises too? And if that is the case, where did the data come from? What is the provenance? And how good is your projection into the need which you made? Thank you.
So one of the things the report was lauded for is we didn't try to sort of solve national technology strategy as a whole in our initial tackle. Almost we left that, I mean, it wasn't our job, that's the science advisor's job. But second is we tried to say where could analytics be helpful? And so actually every single academic, and often it was like 22 kind of PIs across the country, plus another 5 underneath each of them, they were using the data that they had. So every single study in that final report is based on different deep levels of data that those academics did, but we chose academics, other than the situational awareness ones, who were deeply, deeply embedded and knowledgeable about their particular technology and industry sectors. And so I'm going to give you one example. Under the COVID pandemic, Admiral P was responsible. He did the classic sort of pandemic preparedness response, which is he brought together the big 5 and said, how many masks and respirators can you produce? And they said, it's this much. And he estimated that was half of what he needed. And this was pre-national network, smart young PhD student came and said, I can use NLP and I can scrape the B2B sites. And he came up with small and medium-sized businesses across the country that were producing masks and respirators. Some of them had bought equipment on Alibaba, and they were previously construction workers. They were, waste management companies. They were oil filter rigs, and he could see that. And also, they were saying their capacity. I have 2 pieces of equipment. I can make this many a day. Like right there on that. So he modeled that. That was between 20 and 50% more capacity than Admiral P thought he had, and that was because of the small and medium-sized businesses across the country. So in these various cell analytics, if you look at the process as a whole, sometimes they're way in there at the details of jobs and people. Sometimes they're way in there at the details of like, what else capacity do we have in terms of economic dynamism? Obviously, in semiconductors, we don't want to ask who, he was able to see like at the second by second level, if you wanted, who was adding themselves on, that result. Obviously, in semiconductors, we're not going to be having new small and medium-sized firms adding production capacity, right? It's like $1 billion to set up a new facility, but we might be wanting to look at the workers and their capabilities. So these are individuals. What we chose them for was being able to ask very, very smart questions and find the ground level data and the deep technical knowledge and industrial knowledge and relationships to be able to answer those questions.
Marvi.
So these 2 questions are for Erica primarily. The first one, I try to simplify it. It's a little bit convoluted, so pardon that. So while the models that you're talking about, they predict economic viability for technologies, for example. My question is, do they incorporate what would happen culturally and geopolitically? So what I mean by that is, sometimes natural language models or massive, data type models would actually include more like market data, for example. But do you include also systems dynamics integration perspectives where, macroeconomic policy matters, right? When you make a decision here, that influences what another country will do, which then comes back and influences what we decide in the future. Do you typically integrate that systems dynamic perspective?
So first, I want to say that one reason this is such a beautiful area for NSF is because bending academics to this problem is new. And it's going to be needed across disciplines. I believe that it requires building a new field because we need to take certain capabilities from natural language processing, certain capabilities from economics, certain capabilities from techno-economic modeling, resource modeling, right? And also not be dumb about it, right? We need parameters around what is good practice and not good practice, right? So if I'm modeling a industrial production system, just as a very this is an area, but that's my bread and butter. We take all the products in the firm and we make sure that if we're running them through our system, that in the model, that it matches what it looks like on the shop floor in the firm after we've taken the shop floor data before we try any what if scenarios, right? And then we also ask what's bounded. Like, are we outside the bounds of what we think is reasonable to expect of this environment, right? We can add equipment, but maybe at a certain point in time, we need to add a building or something like that. So I think the key here is that to do this well needs to be done carefully and precisely, and to understand the limitations of each of the things we're doing. The second is that I do not like the word prediction or forecasting. I think what is really important, and there are many people who refer to it that way, but if you think about what a engineer does in building a bridge, right? I'm building a bridge. I'm not predicting whether or not a boat is going to drive into my bridge. I'm not predicting whether or not there's going to be a hurricane. I am saying, I want to make sure my bridge is robust or resilient to these scenarios, right? And so in that setting, what I showed you said, if China does this, what would happen to mines around the world? What would happen to commodity prices, right? So right there was a little bit of economics just added in there, right? But they also, because they're engineers working with resource economists and have, be carefully looking at those two together, they're saying, would we be able to add another mine or a mine that has been shut down? How long would it take to bring it up online, right? So those questions are in there. At the next level, if you're using battery production modeling, we've now added the price of the commodity changing into the battery production model. So then you're saying so probably the industrial organization economics model that you saw is saying, basically, okay, now the price of batteries has changed. How does the price of conventional vehicles and of electric vehicles change? And then how does that change in price change the ability of consumers? So the number of households, we have it quantified that could no longer buy a car, right? And so that is not saying what happens next by China. It's not saying, right? So we can say, well, what does China do next? What does US do next? You could choose to use wargaming to look at that. Do you want it? Companies do wargaming as well. Do you want to go that direction? Some people believe that you should use systems modeling, not wargaming, right? So, that putting these together, that is a new field, because while we've been doing that in some places, we haven't done that across the board. The last I want to say about that is, for example, we have up online now with the IRA. It's not a complex analysis, but a model that says with the subsidies for the IRA, given that some of these people, they're trusted by industry because they also can produce analyses for industry, but they have passion for government questions. So one question, it's going to be presented at the NBER, that they've looked at is, why wouldn't firms have been resilient to this, right? Why wouldn't firms have just worried about this? Shouldn't this be taken by the market? And it turns out they passed all of the rising prices onto the consumer. So it was the consumer, right, that paid. And so I think similarly, when you look at the last analysis I showed you with change in market share in Europe, that's a more classic, pure economics analysis, right? Using difference in difference and different. So where we want to use different methods and what can you bring together and how can you do that carefully and with integrity? That's what we need to forge.
All right, I'm gonna. Thank you. So we just have 10 minutes left. So I'm going to take two pairs of questions. So let's get Scott and Dorota to ask both questions, one after the other, and then the panelists can respond. And then I'm going to go to Kevin and Punch to do the same. So please, Scott.
Well, thank you so much.
Actually, I think Scott was, go ahead. I'm just going by order. So Scott, go ahead, okay. And then Dorota right after.
First, I'm embarrassed to say that I had no idea that the threat assessment section was in there on tip. And I'm thrilled that it's in there. So thank you very much for telling us what we should be acting on. But I just want to comment that I would love the board to real time be involved with that process, because that would inform our decisions, that flows into broader impacts really with our commercial and national security responsibilities, even into the merit review digest that we're revamping right now. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Dario. I actually have a comment and a question. Erica, I'd like to build on the example that you gave of assessing the workforce needs in the great state of Ohio. I happened to be in Ohio at the time. I just left 3 months ago, but my observation is, so when the industry comes to town and they actually put money on the table, as Intel has done, there was an incredible collaboration among the academic institutions across the state. This was the first time I have seen R1 institutions working all the way to the 2-year colleges and building a pipeline. But Intel made it very clear. We want to have scalable, standardized, transferable curricula, so across the board, identical and the same. And it happened. Now, at that point, we felt like we will never, ever deliver the needs that Intel and other companies may need. So we started looking outside, trying to build the regional partnership. And you actually touched upon this, Dario. So we actually connected with academics from Indiana, from Michigan, from Illinois, Kentucky. So now you have 5 states, 32 academic institutions trying to do what Intel, and at that time, 12 other board members we had, industry board members. And of course, academics had the desire, but the problem happened at the border of the states, as you can imagine. So it actually connects to what you said, Dario, that there is a mechanism, there is a set of incentives needed. I don't know, federal government, industry, those nonprofits, really to incentivize states to work together, because it still tend to be like, let me hold it within the boundary of my state. So this is just a comment. It's a live example, and I don't know what it happens to this network now, because I left the university. I was probably the only champion of this. Question is, what is government thinking, or what is in your thinking a mechanism to actually bring those states together, build the regional capacity rather than single state? Thank you.
Rather than speaking to analytics, I actually would love to have Erwin and Ponch speak to what, I mean, you've been working on, we just provide the problems.
Of RIE work, I think, why don't you talk about that, Erwin?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks, Erica, for the great work that you've done and for the way that you presented it this morning. So to answer the question that was just posed, look, I think that part of what we're trying to do here is really, as Dorota noted, try to be able to take real-time data that we have access to at the state and local level and be able to say, okay, the investments that we are pouring into projects like AI Institutes or the Regional Innovation Engines program, for instance, how are the people who are being funded by those projects, how are the people who are being touched by those projects landing in terms of the jobs that they pursue subsequently, right? And so I think that is really part and parcel, a piece of this effort, in addition to the technology. Erica doesn't like it when I say forecasting, but the technology efforts that we have as well to try to be able to understand what are the areas that we should be focusing in on and honing in on vis-a-vis national security implications in particular, right? So where are we relative to the People's Republic of China, for instance, in specific areas, and how might we move a needle potentially by virtue of additional investment in a specific sub-area relative to the investments that other nations are making as well?
Okay, Kevin, and then Punch, please.
Thank you. One of the major elements of our thinking towards something like an NDEA 2.0 is the workforce development piece, the STEM talent for the future, and thinking about different ways to incentivize and reward place-based innovations, certainly around technological capability, manufacturing capability, whatever it may need, but also in parallel with that, investing in the people. Right, the widgets don't make themselves for the most part. People make the widgets, or people have to be involved. And so, this idea of a quantitative, critical assessment capability for the technologies brought to mind. Is there a similar approach to thinking about existing workforce capabilities? What are the specific kinds of skilling, upskilling, retraining, educational, curriculum development, whatever all it may be that's necessary to take the workforce that you have now, and maybe this is done state by state, I don't know, but the workforce that you have now, some ability to rapidly assess their capabilities with respect to the technological capabilities that that are needed. Is there thinking around that?
Yeah, I want to just say two very brief things on this. The first is we have been pioneering the ability to, and I want to give you two very brief cases. One is on the shop floor, as we're going through technology transitions, what the impacts are for the workforce. And then when I say we, I want to say in our team at Carnegie Mellon, Christoph Kumbamal in particular, has been pioneering really on the manufactured products type of area. So you saw a little bit of that here, but we also have assessments, frankly, in vehicle electrification. There was all this talk about there were fewer jobs with electric vehicles, but everyone assumed the number of parts equaled the number of jobs. But of course, like producing steel has no parts, but there's many hours of jobs. And so we were able to demonstrate Actually, there's more jobs in a battery than in a conventional, and more skills required for that. So just to say that we are able to do that, and I'm delighted to talk about that. Also on our team, incredible work by Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford in AI, in terms of looking at workforce capabilities, and many of his disciples. And then the third is also very interesting work by Dashun Wang, who is funded under the current APTO program, where he was looking at where was there an underutilage of AI in sort of the acceleration of science in the National Network report, compared to the potential, and where were the bottlenecks in that? Was it that he was looking at course curricula for the National Network project, and whether or not it wasn't being taught, or weren't there enough faculty collaborating? And I know NSF has a big program in that area. So just to say that this is an area that we can contribute and be supportive. And then the other I just wanted to say very briefly is, while it is not inside the analytics aspect, I am quite compelled that there's a real opportunity from a funding perspective in taking some of the work in smart tutors that has been done in the K through 12 area and applying that to lifelong learning, maybe compiled with like a Google Glass type of, I'm learning across people across the nation. So that's just in being fascinated with those challenges. I think there's a lot
Andrew
there.
may have something to say about this too. I was curious specifically about the fact that
quickly, if I can add,
that you can't force people to learn what you want them to learn, right? So there's a lag, and there's a sociological aspect too.
A model the board might look at is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation's Talent Pipeline Management Program, TPM. It's been around for a decade. It's a bottom-up collaborative approach between industry and community colleges and universities at the local level, in which a group of employers who are all employing the same kind of worker with same skills and occupations get together, pool their information to say, okay, how many do you need? How many do you need? What are our best resources? What are the best sources of educated labor for us? And come up and then sit down with the educators to say, this is our demand. Here are the skills we need. And can you all work with us to? So this is it's a bottom-up approach that is customized, tailored to local needs. And the Chamber Foundation has a training academy to train local folks how to do this. And the result is you create relationships within industry. They learn they're competitors, but they also have to share information. So how do you cooperate and compete at the same time? And rationalize the supply chain of labor locally.
All right, let me pull the last set of comments and questions for the final 5 minutes. So Punch, Vic, and Heather, and please.
Maybe I'll pass so they have a chance. I want to reflect on a few things. First is Navin and Andrew and Erica, great job. So I'm glad that you had identified the Roadmap Summit as an exemplar of how we bring together this kind of thinking. So that's the first thing that I think I'm glad that, because when I was there the last 2 days, it's just a phenomenal way of bringing together the folks. One of the comments that was made is what kind of an agency can do this, and there are many examples of what is there, but we are not exercising it to the fullest extent. My worry has been for the last few years is that it's so balkanized. Each of these, while we do these analysis, and you've done a fantastic job, and it's a pilot. Let's be very clear, it's a pilot analysis, and we don't have the resources right now that has to be deployed for us to do this in a systemic way, in a consistent way. That's something that I place it on the table. But our whole work has been balkanized in so many ways that the actionable pieces, therefore, are much more done in individual agencies, or in our case, we partnered with EDA to do this. And that has produced some significant outcomes in terms of the regional innovation engines. It calls for this coordination of ensuring that multi-agency, you talk about multi-sector, multi-agency, multi-sector approach is how we are going to take on these challenges and solve them. I would be remiss if I didn't say this, because you pointed TIP, and I'm so glad that you did then and talked about it, because I want the board to hear about TIP from outside folks rather than us always talking about TIP and AI institutes. I want the board to hear that, so I'm glad you mentioned that. But I also wanted the board to be aware that this is not just resident in TIP. If I can go to each of my directorates, whether it is engineering or whether it is computing, whether it is social behavioral economic science or MPS, each one of them is engaged in this kind of an activity, but not just only the discovery level, but also the discovery translation to the impact level. So that's something that I hope the board will get a chance to listen to these things. And I'm going to have 2 of them present in the February meeting of the kinds of work that they're doing. It's important for the board to be informed by what happens at NSF, not only hearing from the outside, but also hearing from the inside. So I recommend that. So these are some thoughts that I wanted to take this moment to reflect upon. And thank you so much for your observations.
Thank you. That's incredibly valuable. Thank you. Vic?
Yes, thank you. Great presentation, both Erica and Andrew. Just some thoughts on what you remarked in terms of getting the best talent, the best brains on this kind of new effort. Andrew, you're at GW, so you know about the consortium of universities that are here. Erica, you've worked on plenty of these things. I would just say some takeaways when you talk about the best brains is also to include in your language, look at the members of the colloquium. So you have people like UDC. Also think about institutions, like UT El Paso, like Morgan State University, a broader breadth of institutions and community colleges and technical schools. I'm a product of NDA 1.0, mostly public schools at that time, and then also mostly engaging the R1s. So I want to make sure that you put in your language also this broader breadth of where do we find the best talent? Because again, NDA 1.0, and at the time of Vannevar Bush, that best talent was basically on the East Coast, a certain group of institutions. I think now for the problems that we face, since many of the conflicts, both economic and national security, will be non-kinetic, will involve talent from across the United States in many different institutions in many different places. And so just making sure you punctuate that as part of it too, because for example, NSF, we've been supporting for the past 2 years, the Journal of Advanced Technology, which is community colleges in terms of research. 1945, 1950, we didn't think about research in community colleges, nor when we did pass NDA 1.0. But now some of the best work, particularly in, for example, EVs and lithium batteries, is being done at these places, as well as some of the work in training those workers. So just leaving that, as a takeaway.
Okay, but I give you 30 seconds.
30 seconds. I just want to say, one, I am so passionate about that. Also, we have analyses in the report, which I didn't refer to. Willie May was on our board for the National Network, and we have analyses looking at demographic and geographic gaps in skills, as well as opportunities for investments.
All right, love to hear from, I think the last one's Heather and Ryan. If you can both share your comments and questions, please. Heather.
Thank you, and Eric and Andrew, thank you for your work. Just building on what Panch just said, there is some of this work going on in a variety of places. There's a huge amount of comparable work being done in the Defense Department, in both the Navy as well as the Space Force, and also in the intelligence community. And I think one of the things that the board might do that might be useful is any new structure that looks at scientific or technical surprise, or how to use these tools to strengthen the supply chain for America and strengthen both economically and for national security, will probably have a very different structure from what we're used to in the federal government. What would be new? How would we set that up so it's not balkanized, but that it's permeable? And how would we do that? Because that would be a really useful element in any NDA 2.0, to say, here's how government is going to innovate in order to be able to address some of these problems in a completely new and different way, because the threat is greater now than it's been at any time since World War II of scientific and technical surprise and being reliant on supply chains that we don't control that undermine us in a time of crisis. And so I just think there's something here, and be very happy to engage with those who are interested to figure that out.
Heather, I would love to talk about that further. I just got an eye from Dario that I could say one thing. But I just want to say that we had thought that we were going to have a problem of like an antibody response from the agencies. And we were wrong. Our antibody response was from the FFRDCs. We were told by the intelligence community that they didn't have anything like this, and it was the best they had seen. We were also asked to present to the Defense Microelectronics Commons and the Cross-Agency Semiconductor Group, and we had someone who led the Semiconductor Initiative taken into the DOC to implement that. We also have had implementation of our measures in DOE and in DoD, and more funding actually in those areas. So I'm really interested in this question.
Let's follow up. Let's you and I follow up, because no matter what happens here today, let's you and I get connected and understand this a little more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Heather, I just want to add a comment. Erica mentioned the 10 key technology focus areas that TIP is responsible for analyzing. There's not one technology on that list that only one federal agency is responsible for. And my experience is that, say, CHIPS, I talk to people in the CHIPS program who are frustrated. They're not talking to DOD, they're not talking to DOE, they're not talking to NSF about those agencies' work on CHIPS. And that person asked me to convene the agencies. So there is a balkanization problem within the federal government. You can take any of those technologies, there's multiple agencies, they're not talking to each other. At least people are in those agencies are telling me they're not talking to each other.
That's an excellent point. All right, Ryan, we're giving you the last comment and question.
Thank you so much for this report. It's so captivating, and I know it's the beginning. One question or a thread to pull on is there's nothing stronger than the market forces pieces. And so for the critical technology areas, do you have a sense of not only the market sizes for each of them, but the margin potential and like what competition American companies are facing, to just put those realities out there?
I think in some of the pioneering work that NSF does, no one knows that answer yet, right? Like, just to be very clear, I think in terms of bringing technologies to market, we can talk. So our analyses were, we took a wide, not we, I'm saying we for the whole network. They took a very wide range of scenarios and said, under, production of vehicles in 2030 in the worst case scenario and the best case scenario. So we actually showed you the most conservative. It could be worse.
All right. Given the level of interest, we could be here for another hour for sure. So I just want to thank Navin. Thank you for joining us from Korea, for all the work you've done and advancing this effort. And Andrew and Erica, thank you. This has been fantastic. And as it's clear, it's just the beginning of that conversation, but we really tremendously appreciate you joining us and the work that you are doing. So thank you.